Well, thank you for that kind introduction, and I want to start by just thanking the Prime Minister personally for the Government of Canada's support for the beautiful new Ivy building that we dedicated in early September. It's truly one of the best business school facilities in the world.
I appreciate that. And let me just begin, Dean, by obviously thanking Western and the business school, the Ivy Business School, for hosting this today. We do appreciate the opportunity, and particularly we appreciate your president's good work accompanying me to China, heading the task force. Good work on behalf of Canadians and some Government of Canada research. We appreciate the university's willingness to serve the broader Canadian body politic.
We look forward to that. So today's topic is international trade and investment, and then a little bit on the state of the Canadian economy. So I'm happy to talk to you about that today. Most of my work is academic work has been on international business topics, and Ivy is an incredibly international place. So just about half of our faculty were born abroad. Many of them are Canadian citizens now. I'm an example of a recent import. And our programs are quite international as well. About a third of the executive MBAs, or about a third of the regular MBAs are from outside of Canada. So I think it's a very relevant topic. So I'm hoping to start today just talking a bit about trade, and you recently announced the CETA agreement. Can you tell us what's the benefit for Canada in particular? I think there's general agreement among economists that at a high level, free trade agreements are good, but specifically how does that apply to Canada?
Well, look, I'd say this agreement is big for three reasons. Mm-hmm. First of all, it gives, going to give virtually tariff-free access to the single largest market on the planet, which is the 28 countries of the European Union, notwithstanding their present challenges. This is a market of over 500 million, largely very affluent customers. 98% of tariffs will come off as soon as the agreement comes into effect. So it's obviously big for that reason. It's also extremely comprehensive. In fact, the Economist noted, I think it really will be a new global standard. We didn't just deal with the kind of traditional trade areas of goods. We're also liberalizing services, investment rules, regulatory processes. It really is very, very broad and sweeping in scope. And therefore, as your president mentioned and others, for the service sector, well beyond kind of the traditional areas you would expect, like agriculture or the auto sector, for Canada and for Ontario and the GTA specifically, there's just tremendous additional access gained to this market. So, as I say, it's big in terms of the marketplace, broad in terms of scope. I think the third thing that probably is underappreciated and most important is it's our big breakthrough in dealing with a problem of potential isolation that we saw when we came to government. And we came to government in 2006 in spite of the fact that Canada is one of the most open trading economies in the world. Canada had free trade agreements with only 5 countries in the entire world. Really ironic when you consider that it was Canada and the U.S. that really struck the first big kind of post-Cold War globalization trade agreement. And yet here we were with virtually no trade deals with anybody. And in a world where, as you know, trade is not just about sending bananas in exchange for cars, it's about global value chains. There has been a risk as other blocks increasingly get developed that Canada would become just marginalized in terms of global supply chains and the world trading system. We've been trying to deal with that. We'd signed trade deals with 9 countries since we came to office, and now with this really big one, with such a big important player, it doesn't solve. It doesn't mean the problem is completely fixed in the future, but certainly the chances of us getting marginalized the way we could have are severely diminished. So I think it's just a great deal all around. I think it will be good for virtually every sector of our economy.
Okay, so I know the EU is a huge trading bloc. Yeah. Actually, over the last 10 years, they've had fairly slow growth and continue to have economic challenges. How would you compare this, doing a deal like CETA versus, say, signing something with China or India or Latin America that are, smaller economies but actually growing much faster?
Well, look, obviously, there would be big opportunities there. Mm-hmm. We are in trade negotiations with India. with South Korea, with Thailand, with Japan, and we're part of the Trans-Pacific negotiating bloc. So look, obviously, making progress on any one of those fronts would be important. But I think the fact of the matter is, no country in the world has or would expect to have as comprehensive and ambitious deal as we have with Europe, with China today. I mean, that's just not their kind of framework, and it's not India's
They're not ready for that.
It's
right?
not India's kind of framework. So look, obviously we want to make progress there. We've, as you know, succeeded in getting a foreign investment protection and promotion agreement with China, and we want to do more in terms of trade with that part of the world, and eventually sign some trade agreements. But there would be no prospect, realistically, of an agreement this deep and this comprehensive with one of those countries. That's not their kind of model.
Okay. So we've talked a fair amount about the kind of the potential gains or the likely gains from that, and I think most economists would say at the macro level, countries benefit, but there's clearly in the short run winners and losers. Some sectors get ahead, some people are displaced and have to move into other areas. Can you talk about the policy framework as what's the government of Canada doing to kind of mitigate some of those short-term adjustment costs?
Yeah, look, so much of this agreement, you don't really know what's going to happen to the agreement until it gets out there and people decide whether and how they'll take advantage of it. We have not identified a lot of really obvious losers. As you know, the support for the agreement is virtually unanimous across various sectors, industrial groups in the Canadian economy. There are three areas where we have made commitments to the provinces to provide some compensation. The first and obvious one is in the dairy sector, specifically cheese. As you know, we've agreed to allow significantly more European cheese in, although frankly, the actual effect on Canadian industry's market share, in our judgment, should be relatively small and transitory. But we will provide some assistance there.
This is kind of a contingent thing. You don't think the effects will be so big, but in case they are,
there will be some short-term, mid-term impact, but it will not be large. And as I say, we have committed to compensate the sector for that. In terms of, we've got support for the deal from both the generic and brand name manufacturing sectors. There will be some impact due to additional patent protection. There will be some impact on drug costs, particularly for, obviously, provinces who are the major purchasers of drugs. However, once again, these impacts won't be felt for 10 years, and they will be, once again, in our judgment, relatively small in terms of the costs of the Canadian healthcare sector. And we've preserved, a healthy generic industry with its export market access. A third area is a rather smaller one. There's a commitment to phase out what are called minimum processing requirements for fish processing, which has particular effect in Newfoundland. But once again, we think that while there will be some impact there, the benefits of having a whole range of tariffs removed on fish products is just going to be comparatively much bigger for Atlantic Canada. So look, it's a pretty good news story. It obviously took a lot of time and a lot of negotiation to get the kind of deal we wanted. But we're dealing here with a group of countries that have comparable frameworks and ambitions, and so I'm convinced that Canadian business and industry, including universities, will see lots of opportunity.
Okay, that's great. I want to kind of shift a little bit towards trade. So you mentioned supply chains earlier. I think when people take undergrad economics classes, they talk about swapping wine for cheese or whatever, and finished products.
Guns and butter.
Right, and
everybody remembers guns and butter.
But a huge amount of trade is actually intra-company now, where you'll manufacture certain parts in one country and assemble them in another and ship them around, and that's really driven by foreign direct investment. So I know your government over the last 5 or 6 years has been somewhat more interventionist in approving trade deals. There's a net benefit test in some, or not trade deals, specific investments. Do you see investment as kind of fundamentally different than trade agreements, or it's a complement? it seems as if the government is somewhat more involved in approving specific deals.
Well, we actually have, broadly speaking, there's two kinds of protections we have on investment. Actually, there's three kinds. There's a narrow kind where there's a couple of industry where we have specific restrictions. Then there are a couple of broader criteria. Obviously, there's thresholds at which investment is reviewed. Our government has actually raised those thresholds. They're being raised again through the trade agreement with Europe. And then, of course, there are, for understandable reasons, national security reviews on certain types of transactions. I think it's fair to say our government has been more interventionist in the sense that previous governments never turned down any investment ever. We have only rejected 2 investments as a government. But look, I think we're struggling with the following. We want the Canadian economy to remain open for foreign direct investment. Those investment levels in Canada are continuing to increase and increase significantly. At the same time, we've had to tackle this issue. It really came up in the context of potential large-scale takeovers in the oil sands business. We welcome foreign direct investments of all kinds, including we have significant state-owned investors in Canada.
Coming into Canada.
But I don't think, as Canadians, we would want to see entire sectors of the Canadian economy become predominantly state-owned by a foreign country. As I've said before, we spent a long time in Canada essentially getting the government out of business so that we could have essentially a market-oriented economy. I don't think we would want, and not that we don't want state-owned investment, we have lots of it, we're continuing to get it, but we don't want it to become such that certain sectors of our economy would be transformed into foreign state-owned industries. I don't think that's actually good for the Canadian economy. It's not the kind of model we're seeking. And I think one would suggest that the evidence would suggest if you got to very high levels in certain industries, that could actually damage the competitiveness of the economy. So obviously we're going to look for cumulative effects with that kind of investment. But as I say, broadly speaking, we continue to encourage investment from all kinds of actors, both in the developed and in the emerging economies, both private and state-owned, and it continues to grow.
I know early in my career...
And we continue to be an outward foreign investor as well that's growing significantly.
Yeah, quite aggressively, actually, yeah. No, early in my career, I spent 5 years in Poland, and I used to say the 2 biggest fears of the policymakers were, first, that the foreign investors would come and buy up all the good assets, and second, that the foreign investors wouldn't show up.
Right.
So there's always a little bit of trade-off there.
Right, and I do think the trade-off. Let me just address an issue that's come up frequently since we announced some of the new guidelines on state-owned enterprise, that there's a lack of clarity. I would agree that there is margin. I would put it this way. There is margin for the government to exercise its judgment. And in my opinion, when you are dealing with large state investors, foreign governments as the investor, I think it would be foolish for the Canadian government to provide absolute clarity. It is absolutely necessary when the investor is a foreign government for the government of Canada to be able to exercise its discretion and have direct conversations with those foreign investors.
So would you say it's largely a rules-based regime with some discretion at the margin? Is that a
That's a very fair. We still have, look, I'm well aware of the experiences of Canadian economies, Canadian investors elsewhere, and I'd say with very few small exceptions,
right,
Canada would be the most rules-based in the world.
So, okay, just kind of one more topic on investment. So the Canadian dollar has been actually quite strong over the last few years, and that certainly affects competitiveness, probably not so much on natural resources exports because there's a limited supply of those, but it hurts on manufacturing and services and everything else. Have you seen that foreign investors are looking elsewhere because of this cost competitiveness issue here or not? Is that a problem, a long-run challenge, or do you think that that's just a reflection of the state of the economy?
Well, I don't. as you know, the Prime Minister tries to avoid commenting on the monetary policies of the Bank of Canada. We have confidence in the Bank of Canada. I do tend to believe, as an economist, when you have a floating exchange rate, that over time it tends to be a reflection of the general competitiveness of the economy. That said, look, we recognize there are challenges in a higher dollar in certain industries. That said, there are obviously benefits in other industries, and one of the benefits in the manufacturing industry of a higher dollar is it actually makes the importation of equipment and major technological investments much cheaper. And one of the things we've been trying to do through our science and technology strategies that we talked about, through things like the accelerated capital cost allowance on manufacturing equipment, is to try and get our manufacturing and tech industries to really bring in that kind of equipment, really kick themselves up to another level, because our judgment, I think everybody's judgment, is that for advanced economies like ours, we're not going to compete on labor, we're not going to compete on, obviously, on price with low-end stuff. We've got to be niche-oriented, high-end, lots of capital investment. And so I think it does have, notwithstanding the other challenges it creates for the sector, it does have that advantage of making the acquisition of high technology and equipment cheaper. Okay.
That's actually a good transition into my third topic, which is, I'm wondering if you can take a couple of minutes and just give us your sense of the scorecard for the Canadian economy. So the last 5 years, the global economy has had relatively slow growth following the financial crisis. The emerging economies are growing quicker, but where would you say you have high confidence in the economy, and what are the challenges, kind of in the context of the global economy, not just domestically?
First of all, let me just maybe, Bob, if you don't mind, just mention,
Sure.
Obviously the job numbers are out today. And
that's important.
we see there's there's some modest growth. We're obviously pleased to see once again growth in jobs. It's been a pretty steady trend. I think the trend is more important than the month-to-month numbers for reasons you and I discussed earlier, but the trend is now well over 1 million net new jobs created in Canada since the trough of the recession.
Right.
Which really is a performance record with very few rivals among advanced countries. Most advanced countries aren't back to the employment levels they had prior to the recession. So, look, I think, the short answer to your question, I'll give you a short answer, I'll give you a long answer. The short answer is this. The Canadian economy, as I think we all recognize, has done relatively quite well compared to virtually almost all other advanced economies. A couple of exceptions to that, and the fundamentals are very, very strong. Balance sheets of governments are pretty good. The banking sector is the strongest in the world.
Yep.
And the country has all kinds of other, stable politics and all kinds of other assets. In fact, I like to put it this way, and it's not to say we all know there are emerging economies that are growing more quickly, but I can tell you when I go to these various international meetings and meet heads of government, whether they're in advanced countries or emerging countries, there's virtually no head of government who wouldn't prefer to be in my position than in the one they're in. So I think, that's a pretty positive measure. Now, to kind of look at it on a little more sober basis, we continue, for obvious reasons, to benchmark ourselves against the United States, against developed countries, obvious benchmarks. And by those benchmarks, we're doing reasonably well. That said, obviously, these countries are all struggling. And I think as we look at them, our concern is they're not just struggling now. There's some pretty long-term and deep-seated problems in some of these economies. So if we really want to provide the standards of living that our people expect and that we should be able to attain, we are going to have to do better going forward than just be at the top of the G7. Mm-hmm. And we've got the capacity to do that. We're as I say, all the assets I mentioned before. We're a country that not just developed and advanced with a skilled workforce and advanced industrial sectors. We do have Minister of Natural Resources is here from Toronto Minister. We do have the one of the strongest primary sectors in the entire world as well, which is obviously going to put us in great demand and gives us great capacity to increase those trade links that you and I talked about earlier. So all those, look, I think we've got to do better, but I think all of the things say that we can do better, and everything in front of us should look really positive. What are the things we have to do better at or to worry about? I think we're trying to get ahead of those things. Obviously, our fiscal position at national level remains strong. I'm not going to. A couple of provinces could do better, but that's we have.
You don't want to name them, do you?
Yeah, we have a federal system of government, so they got to take care of their own issues. But obviously, we're making sure while times are relatively better that we get our deficit back down to zero and keep our debt burdens falling. We're all aware of the how extended some Canadian households are. I don't think we should exaggerate this problem. I mean, the fundamental reason Canadians have increased their borrowing is that it's cheap to increase your borrowing. And you and I are both economists. We know if interest rates are near zero, there's a lot of sense in people borrowing more money. That said, we know there are some households that are overextended, and we've taken actions in terms of mortgage insurance and other rules to try and moderate that. I think they're having some effect. I've talked earlier about the things we're trying to do both directly with industry and in terms of partnerships between industry and the academic and scientific communities, things we can do to increase the productivity and competitiveness, particularly of our advanced or manufacturing sectors. We're trying to get ahead. I know there's some dispute about it, but I think if anyone's actually out there in the marketplace talking to employers, they know we have a serious problems coming in terms of skills mismatch. And we are obviously working with employers and trying to work with others to make sure we get ahead of that particular problem. But I can tell you now, and this is more than anecdotal, I travel and I talk to a lot of people in this country. I can tell you already, particularly in Western Canada, there are investment decisions that are being held back or not being proceeded with because of the fears or realization that there will simply not be the skilled workforce available. So these are real issues that have to be dealt with. So look, I think there's a number of areas where we need to do better, but I think we are on top of them and getting ahead of them.
So just kind of I just want to follow up on that last thing, and this will be my last question, which is I know, the labor market it looks very different depending on where you stand. So I've been talking to a lot of recruiters, Ivy recruiters, and they're saying, we can't get enough high-skilled people, we can't find the skills we're looking for. And then you look at, not Ivy grads, they're doing fine, but you look at graduates from
Just
other...
to reassure you all. Yeah.
But you look at people with less education or from in non-business majors or non-technical majors, and they're saying the job market's really slack. So there seems to be a mismatch between some of the skill sets being produced and what the employers are looking for. Do you have any thoughts on that, or how to address that?
Yeah, look, I basically two thoughts. First of all, as we know, there are significant demographic challenges coming, and some countries are going to be much more severe than Canada, but it is a fact that the baby boom is retiring and the labor force is not going to grow, even with we have the largest per capita immigration program in the world. Even with that, our labor force is simply not going to grow at the rate it's grown in the past, and that will have an impact without enhanced productivity on Canadian growth. So that demographic bulge is real. But what complicates it is the fact that there are mismatches. And look, I would say this, and it's not meant as a criticism of the academic community, it's just because we have a great advanced education system in our country. But I think the evidence just suggests that if we just continue to do things the way we're doing them, that our system will produce a shortage of tradespeople, scientists, engineers. This is the pattern, and we know the pattern. It's there and it's obvious. And in other areas, it will produce surpluses and and obviously it's always good for low-skilled people to upgrade. So look, we've got to find ways of trying to address some of those challenges. They're not catastrophic, but they are important. And I can tell you before we hit the global recession, in many parts of the Canadian economy, but particularly in Western Canada, we were having very, very real recruitment challenges that were infecting investment decisions. Even now, not fully recovered, we're seeing those things begin to reappear. And all the demographic evidence suggests to me and suggests to employers they're going to get worse. So I think rather than some trying to come up with studies pretending that this doesn't exist, that's got to tell you something about the quality of your data, because they do exist, they are going to exist, and we do have to tackle them.
Okay, that's great. I think I'm gonna wrap up kind of my section of this. I think this has been a very good overview of both kind of international trade and investment and kind of where the economy is now. So I want to thank the Prime Minister for that. And we're going to shift over. I'm going to hand it off to Tony Frost, who's going to take us to the next. I think you're over there. We're going to kind of go into a Q&A with some of the students. So thank you, Prime Minister.
Thanks.
Yeah, let's give a